When we travel, especially internationally, I have this thing about signage. And in most airports, in the airports in the United States, when you are on those walkways, it says, watch your step. Well, in China, it says, don't collide. Now, I think that's a really good idea. Let us not collide at the end of the moving walkway. But my favorite one is really from Britain when it says, mind the gap. You'll see it in the subway when you're getting off of the subway and onto the platform, when you see it on the bottom of an escalator, when you see it in various places where there's a gap and things maybe are moving or slow, and you have to mind the gap, pay attention to your feet in order to clear what could be dangerous. And you don't want to find yourself in the gap because it could be very difficult to get out, and you want to just simply walk over. Yet, I don't know about you, but when I'm in an airport on those moving walkways and even on an escalator, I'm very mindful of the gap. I don't do it gracefully. It looks like some sort of animal trying to get off this moving thing. But it is the space we need to make the transition from something moving to something still. We have to mind the gap. Well, as Judah said a minute ago, we are in our 5 unity principles. And I hope through the course of this month, we've been able to sort of lift them up, kind of like a piece of glass, and let the light shine through them and see that they are multifaceted. It's not just simplistically the words on the page, but it's highly nuanced and gives a real richness and depth to the meaning and understanding of what we call in unity our foundational teachings, our belief system. So today we are looking at that very final step, that very final principle. And to repeat what we just said a minute ago, knowing and understanding the laws of life, also called truth, is not enough. A person must also live the truth that he or she knows. Knowing and understanding, that very first, if we unpack some of these long sentences, it's like, what does that really mean? When we were all young, we learned things like the multiplication tables, arithmetic, we learned how to spell, but really we didn't have a real appreciation, or what I'm going to call an understanding. So in other words, we learned 2 + 2 was 4. But it wasn't until we had a $5 bill and somebody said, give me 1, you have 4 left, the 2 + 2, 3 + 1, 4 + 0. It began to have a greater understanding of what the principles of mathematics were all about. And we struggle with that to sort of move beyond simply that we've memorized things. This is true of the Bible. This is true of poetry. This is true of great art. We see it. We literally say, oh, yeah, I get that. And yet something works on us. Something goes deep within us. And that's what I'm calling the gap. Because, the reality is, even though we're told to mind the gap and jump over it when it comes to the London Tube, the reality of our lives is we live about 99.99% of the time in the gap. And here's what I'm talking about. There is the difference between a revelation of God and the realization of it in your life. You see, revelation from God, as we talked about in the very first principle, is an ongoing, forever, eternal, moment by moment, breath by breath experience. But you and I are human. We can't handle moment by moment, breath by breath revelation. We only pick up the revelation or revelations that really apply to us in the moment. In other words, if you're having a health challenge and you're you may be also getting revelations about prosperity, but in this moment, you're not worried about prosperity or affluence or money. You're worried about your health. So the revelations of spirit that come through your mind and your consciousness right now are the ones you're going to grab onto, and the ones you're going to begin to work with and process and get to know and get to incorporate them. That's that difference. That's that movement between I know a revelation of God and I understand and live from the truth that I know, because we don't really live from the revelation. We live from the truth that we know. Let me give you a few examples from my own life, and I hope that they will encourage you to kind of give some thought to some revelations you've had, whether they're biblical or not. It's not important. Mine happen to be at this point, but they're revelations that in the moment you went, wow. But eventually they began to work into your whole belief system and into your life. The very first one for me that I thought of the other day was Genesis 1:1. Why not start at the beginning? In the beginning, God. Now, I'd heard that since forever. In the beginning, God. But I don't know that I really, really understood what that meant. Many years ago, when I was first into my wild child working days, I was born and raised in Akron, Ohio. It was very Caucasian. It was very the middle of the country. We were a Catholic community. And of course, we're talking about 1950s. We're not talking about a lot of travel, a lot of people coming through. It was basically family and a few more people. Well, Marianne wanted to experience the big world. And so I eventually found myself in San Francisco. And I was working in the bank. And this one particular evening, one of my staff comes up and says to me, Marianne, tomorrow is a Filipino holiday. And in celebration, we're all bringing a specialty dish from home that we really like to celebrate the holidays. And you're not Filipino, so we want you to come as our guest and to experience what our dishes and our cultures and talk about our holidays. And all of a sudden I looked up and I realized for the first time ever in my life, I was the only Caucasian. All the rest of the crew were Asian. I was the one in the minority. Always before in my life, I had been in the the majority. It was a weird experience. It was a weird insight. And I had to really say to myself, is it true? In the beginning, God. And we're all one. They don't speak like me. They don't dress like me, but aren't they people just like me? And it's that moment when you move from, yes, I know, in the beginning, God, everybody's created one and equal, to the realization of, oh my gosh, these people are just like me. There's no difference. They cry, they bleed, they do all the things that I do. We are one in the great oneness of God. When we went to Kenya, it pained me to see the brutality of poachers and trophy hunters. You want to kill this beautiful animal so it can hang on your wall. And I came to realize that not only did you rob the herd of this animal, but you robbed the entire ecosystem, which also robbed the entire universe. In the beginning, God created everything, all of it. And I began at that point to have a really new and deeper appreciation for preservation, for helping the crippled animals and rescues and refuges that happen all over the world in small little ways and in large ways, to continue to help the animals of the Earth's planet. Because what happens to them ultimately happens to us. And of course, we're seeing it now in terms of this global climate change. It's happening to all of us. It's not just in one country. In the beginning, God. I found that to be life-altering shift from what I know, what I memorized, to what I now understand. Another great passage for me was from 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9. My grace, Paul is scribing that God had spoken to him and said, my grace is sufficient for you. And I've pondered that passage a lot. Thy grace. And I had a friend who created a song, Thy grace is my sufficiency. And I used to sing it all the time. What does that mean? I can memorize the words, but what does it mean? Charles Fillmore told us that the definition, or his definition of grace, was the unearned love of God. Well, I don't know about you, but that's still a little bit heady from my perspective. To me, grace is that moment of shift. Something happens. We think something, or hear the voice of someone, or we have an idea in our mind. The other morning, I was going through my Facebook page, and I have a friend who is visiting England at this time. And I was working on this talk, but I had just pages of yada, yada, yada. It wasn't going anyplace. I didn't have a connecting link, a theme, an image, an analogy, a story. And in that moment, I thought, mind the gap. Now, I want to be real clear about something. She said nothing about a subway. She didn't have any pictures. It was just in Britain, and it brought back a memory for me. And here's what I also know about these memories. When things like that come up, when a shift happens, it's not for tomorrow. It's not for the next sermon. It's not for lunch today. It is for this moment, whatever this moment might be. Because what happens is, the quote is, grace is sufficient. What does that mean? It only works. It's only sufficient. It only has energy and power for this moment. The shift happened for this moment. And all too often, I learned, so many times the hard way. I think that's a really good, I'll use it in my next sermon. Do you think I can ever find that passage, quote, book, whatever for the next? No, I don't know where I put it. Even if I was preaching next Sunday, I'd be thinking, now I wrote something down here and I just can't remember where I put it. Because it's not sufficient for tomorrow. It's sufficient for today. And as the quote goes on, it says, God's power is made strong in my weakness. So when I'm weak, that grace is sufficient to move me to a different level in my awareness. Now I'm going to live from the truth that I know, because the truth has moved from just a memorization of a passage to a realization of my life. Third example, when I first got into Unity, we had a meditation on Wednesday evening with the class. That was kind of traditional way Unity taught in those years. And so I didn't know anything about meditation, didn't know anything about Unity. And so I would go dutifully every Wednesday night thinking, any minute now I'm going to figure this Unity thing out. And I would sit there from 6:30 to 7, and I think, now, what am I supposed to be doing? And she'd say, now we're going to go into the silence and we're going to connect with God. And I'm like, okay, fine. So I kept my eyes closed and I would sit there week after week, after Wednesday. One night I came in and I wasn't probably in the best of humor. And I said, okay, I'm really sick of this. I don't mean to sound cranky, God, but I'm sitting here night of night, nothing is happening. Nothing is changing. Nothing is working. I'm just showing up. Nothing's happening. So I remember sitting in the chair and she says, now we're going into the silence. And I close my eyes and I, kind of with a tone that you have with God, I just said, are you really in there? I mean, seriously, I'm tired of sitting here. Are you really in there? So I thought, okay, I took a breath. And in that moment, I heard the words, I am. They were so loud. It was like somebody had shouted at me. And you know how you do, and don't lie to me, I know y'all do it. When somebody coughs or say they fall asleep during meditation, you give them the kind of one-eyed look, like you're not really out of meditation, but you're just checking everybody out. And I remember giving them the squinty-eyed look to kind of see if anybody was actually moving or doing. Nobody heard what I heard. And in that moment, those words, Moses and the burning bush and God speaking to this person that was 3,000 years old, to my experience, became personal in the gap of my life. It took me from this gap and quantumly moved me into another one. I'll never forget that day. I'll never forget that feeling. And I'll never forget the message. God is within me, not outside of me, not somewhere else, not in the great temples of the world, but God is within me. The knowing became an understanding. The revelation became a realization that now was moving in and through my life. Our unity principles, they sort of build on one another. And I hope you've gotten that over these last couple weeks, that as we grow in our understanding of God, we grow in our understanding of our connection to that ultimate mystery. Are you in there, God? I am. This great infinite mystery that is ever revealing its great mystery is revealing it to me, to you, continually. And by my thinking and my thoughts, I shut down that revelation or make the gap this big, or I open it up so that that revelation becomes the realization now of how I live my life. And that prayer and the process of prayer is more about softening us than changing anything. It's softening us so that we can hear, softening us so that we can experience it. It's softening us so that we can move through the process of moving through the gap. Because let's face it, sometimes the gap is not easy. I don't want it to sound like, oh, I had this moment of knowing and this brilliant insight. It may have been years in coming to me. It may have been a long time through a long and difficult struggle. But one day I look back and I said to myself, I don't recognize that person anymore. I know it's me. I have pictures. I have the journals. I have memorabilia from those years. But that person and the person that's here today are so totally different because the revelation has become realization in my life. And that's what I hope for all of you as we study and continue to sort of unpack these 5 unity principles, to really hear the deeper message that they are living, working messages that come to us all the time. There are no exceptions. There is nothing you have failed to do or you have done that will keep you from the eternal love of God except your own thinking. So what needs to change, what's the fulcrum of this teeter-totter, is your own thinking about that eternal presence being eternally alive in you. That's the gap. And we have to be very mindful of it because we can't jump over it. We have to walk through it in order to get to the realization of the new life toward which we strive. I hope you've enjoyed this series. We have another fun series coming up in the month of August based on the book, The Four Agreements. And next Sunday, my brother from another mother, Reverend Chaz Wesley, will be with us. And I know you will enjoy his opening us up to the book by Don Luis Ruiz, The Four Agreements. So I look forward to seeing all of you then. Thank you and God bless.